So yeah, what a bizarre topic. Got the topic list. All right, ED Leadership Monthly. Okay, we can talk about burnout and give an update there. I think they're going to fire me. I'm expecting people to say, well, I'm not in that group, so I'm going to take an extended lunch. So if you feel like you're not in the group that should be worried about this, feel free. I would understand if you got up and walked out. But I do think that sometimes we get concerned about performance. We wonder how our rights are protected. And that's what I have focused on in this discussion, and really what our contractual relationship is and what overall our relationship is, so that we don't get surprised. And perhaps when we think our performance is adequate, or even it is even exceeding expectations, perhaps it isn't, or there are some reasons why, from a business standpoint or otherwise, where decisions are made that have nothing to do with your performance. And so we just don't want to be surprised when something changes that may threaten your employment. And the other imperative I'll share with you is, just because you're paranoid doesn't mean they aren't after you. So maybe they are. So let's talk about this for a minute. The first thing is a business concept called the psychological contract. When I came across this about a decade ago, it really made a lot of sense to me. And I think this is the foundation of this discussion. This is the unspoken agreement between two individuals. They're going to do something for you, you're going to do something for them, and it's an unspoken reciprocation. If you maintain a relationship with someone, you make good on promises, you take care of them, they take care of you, the chances of being surprised by somebody saying, hey, listen, we're going to go a different direction, and now we're putting you on a performance improvement plan, or we think we need to move towards separation, you're not going to be surprised if the relationship is good. And neither will the people who you work with if the psychological contract is maintained. And that is really defined oftentimes in the orientation process. And I think orientation is critical for all of us and the people who work with and for us. So there should be a group or hospital or corporate, however you want to define it, orientation, then a kind of a overall hospital orientation that's less of the employment piece, but more getting indoctrinated to how the hospital functions and the different departments that are there. And then a departmental or clinical orientation. I strongly believe there should be a structured orientation program so people understand the expectations. And most important really is having a signature line for the person who is performing the orientation and the person who is being oriented, the orientee. And if both of you sign off and date it and say, yes, we accomplished everything that we thought we should, and as the orientee, you understood everything and you accept what is expected of you and you're committing to it, then you're ready to go on your own. And that makes a lot of sense. If you don't feel comfortable that you're ready and haven't been provided an adequate orientation and you're not ready to function alone, you shouldn't sign it. You should request more intervention. And so it's very important to make sure that as part of the psychological contract, this helps to define what the expectation is and whether you're performing to it early on or how you can perform to it. So I would really make sure that you have this process at the end of any orientation process, whether it takes 3 days or whether it takes a month. Once people are done with this, you sign the agreement, they sign the agreement that you have completed successfully the orientation process, you have a stronger relationship and a foundation to start from where the expectations are understood bilaterally. All right, so let's talk about the employment or the independent contractor agreement, because when you do feel like you may want to leave or you feel like there may be a separation discussion coming your way, you need to know that your agreement is supporting your needs and is helping you along the way. So this is basically like any contract. This helps to enter into a bargain for exchange. So you're going to provide services and they're going to provide something in return. So clinically, you're going to work and they're going to give you compensation. And generally speaking, in contract law, you should be looking for the concept of bilaterality. If somebody's asking something of you, they should be giving something similar in return. So I won't go into any great detailed or lengthy explanations of this in the interest of time. I know that I'm standing between you and lunch. But there are many contracts I've seen out there where someone is expecting you to give something up or to do something, but they're not expecting the same thing of themselves. So one quick example would be, for instance, I saw a real estate contract a few years back when I was moving to Tennessee, and I'd considered an auction as a different, an interesting and innovative way to sell the house to generate interest. And they said, yeah, here's the agreement, and I was close to doing it. And they had a clause in the contract that basically said that if somehow I didn't disclose everything to them, and there's a claim against which was a national real estate firm, there's a claim against them then I'm going to indemnify them and pay all of their defense expenses. They're a huge organization. I won't mention their name, but they're, you would probably guess it in probably 2 or 3 guesses. And I'm going to cover their expenses. So I said, I know a little bit about contracts. I'm not really comfortable with that clause, but I might sign it. Where is the bilateral agreement for me that, let's say you screw this up and I get sued because this was misrepresented in the auction process? Are you indemnifying me and paying my defense expenses? Oh, no, we don't ever do that, and everyone always signs the agreement. I said, they're always sign the agreement because you're not explaining it to them. I'm done having a conversation with you. So that's not bilaterality. You got to look for that. This should memorialize the agreement. So whatever you think you agreed to, when the relationship was perfect, you're being recruited, the relationship is beginning, and everyone's happy, and you say, oh, yeah, we'll make sure we take care of that. Yeah, unfortunately, I'm going to have to see it in writing because that person may not be there any longer, and there may be a disconnect on what we both believe we agreed to. So it's not that you don't trust people. It's making sure that what you agreed to is memorialized and it exists in perpetuity until you ever have to bring out that contract again, which I hope it never has to come out. This should outline the mutual responsibilities and obligations, and again, protect the rights and interests of both parties. It should be equal. You both have rights, you both have obligations. The agreement should outline what those are, and you should be able to understand them and perform to them. And this should be written in plain English and probably doesn't need more than a couple of pages. Anytime you see a 30-page contract that's written in the Queen's English, that's not the way contract law is supposed to be done, and it can be confusing. I would be very careful with that. So the lens and perspective of your agreement. Again, I mentioned just a moment ago about the relationship. It's early. You've been recruited. Everyone's happy. There hasn't been any tension in the relationship yet, and at some point there may be. You may be willing to say, oh, I trust them, and they'll take care of this for me. And you should trust, but you should also make sure that when people put thoughts to writing, they're committing to a concept, and you have to make sure that they're committing to what you agreed to. So don't write your agreement or sign your agreement based on how you feel about the relationship at the beginning, because when you're going to utilize the contract, most likely is at the end of the relationship. How many of you, if you don't mind me asking a personal question, how many of you are married to the first person you ever dated? Oh, that's wonderful. It's to a couple of you. And it's unfortunate you chose not to sit together. So probably not the same person. But anyway, the point I'm making is when you sign an agreement, the chances of you being as lucky as these two, and I'm sorry I didn't turn quick enough before the hands went down here, that the chances of this being the last agreement you have so that you feel so comfortable that, it'll be fine, I'll never have to pull it out. No, we know that for a variety of good reasons, and it doesn't have to be contentious, you are likely to transition at some point, and you need to make sure that your interest and their interests are met at the beginning of the relationship, positioned for when you transition away. Everything's good at the beginning, it's fine. So just make sure that you consider that and don't have retrospective regret. Well, I thought everything was going to be great, but there have been 3 changes in leadership since that time. No one remembers the conversations I had, and when I look at the agreement now, I've said, well, wait, you agreed to this, but it's not in the agreement. Well, if it's not there, we didn't agree to it. There's also something called integration. Integration is really important, not clinical integration, but integration in contract law, that whatever you talked about, whatever you agreed to, if it exists in the agreement, must exist within the 4 corners of the document. 4 corners of any one of the pages, but you get the meaning. It must be in the 4 corners, or everything else you talked about is not part of the agreement. So if you expected it to be adhered to and enforced later, you better see it in writing, or later, even if the person who agreed to it is still there, you say, it's not in the agreement. That was potentially hypothetical. Make sure that you understand that when you sign the agreement, and there's usually a clause that talks about this being a full and integrated agreement, this is the full agreement. There's no side agreements based on handshakes or anything else that supersede the contract. So a couple things you need to think about, and just quickly, professional liability coverage, if you're providing clinical services, make sure you have your tail coverage, unless it's occurrence coverage, where it covers every occurrence, no matter when a claim would come out from the occurrence. Make sure you have tail coverage. And still today, I run into a few people who coverage has changed, or they initially didn't and didn't realize they didn't have it, but they don't have tail coverage when they want to go do something else. And for all of us in this room as leaders, you might want to think about other forms of liability insurance, like directors and officers insurance. So you may want to look at your agreement. You may want to ask your hospital, hey, am I covered for acts that are not medical malpractice? As a nurse manager, as a medical director, what if somebody sues me because of something else that's not related to medicine, because of my leadership role? Am I covered? You need to know that and make sure that that happens. And if it's not in the agreement, at least make sure you have some sort of written document or declaration page that says we cover those acts for you, because you should have some sort of coverage. Signing or sign-on bonuses, just be careful with these. And this happens oftentimes with a younger clinician. It happened to me earlier in my career. So I said the sign-on bonus, it was a big check, and I was so excited. I wasn't employed yet, so there were no taxes withdrawn. So we need to educate people so they're not unhappy when they're going to work for us, that, hey, we're going to give you a sign-on or signing bonus. Make sure you withhold your own taxes so you're not caught next April 15th owing money that you don't have. And probably really understand the terms of repayment. What is the service commitment? Is it 1 year, 2 years, 3 years? What is it? And if in some of the contracts might say, if you don't fulfill the entire service agreement, you pay it all back. Most contracts will say that it'll be prorated, but you need to understand that. Our people, especially younger clinicians who haven't seen it before, need to understand that. If you give them a large signing bonus and then they're still unhappy later, that's an epic fail if they didn't understand it. So I think we need to educate people a little bit about that. More operative language in some of the important clauses. Partnership and ownership. I think partnership and ownership can be wonderful. If it means being able to voice your opinion and have a vote, that is wonderful. But there are some partnership agreements or ownership agreements that invoke a responsibility, a financial obligation. So for instance, if you had a 5-member group that had a contract with a hospital and all of you decided to form this group, and now the group hasn't been doing well, the payer mix shifted, and you owe the bank $1.2 million, well, if you're an owner, you may own a fifth of that debt. So make sure that your ownership or partnership means exactly what you want it to, what you were told it was going to mean, and that it doesn't have any other obligations associated with it. Make sure it's expressly stated in the agreement that you have no financial obligation to the organization. I've seen many contracts that state that, and it's very helpful. So what partnership or ownership really means is maybe profit sharing or a vote or something else. But you cannot accept financial responsibility unless you truly do own a part of the business, and then you get the financial benefit when you've taken that risk as well. All right, so arbitration. There are a lot of people that say, why in the world would I ever sign an agreement with an arbitration clause that says I can't hire my own attorney to defend myself? How many of you would be nervous about signing an arbitration clause? No one. Well, one person. Okay, 2. All right. But not the 2 people who are still married to the person who they first dated and met. So it's good. All right. So the reason why this is a good idea is that this levels the playing field. So if you have a large organization, even if it's just a hospital, and you have one person and there's a dispute, who do you think has more resources to defend their side of the discussion? Let's word it that way. The larger entity. So if you sign an agreement that has a binding arbitration clause in it, that's good for you, because you have to have an agreed upon arbiter, you have to make sure it goes through an appropriate process, and then you will both agree to live by the findings of that process. And so you won't be burdened by having to get a bunch of legal support to match the legal support of the larger entity. So this actually is a wonderful thing for the individual. If there's ever a disagreement, which hopefully if the psychological contract is intact, you can work through those things without ever having to get a third party or an attorney involved. Confidentiality agreements. Just remember that when you decide to go, if you have learned trade secrets from your organization, they're going to tell you you can't share them with other people. They will watch. And if it becomes discovered later that you will be at risk. If you're uncomfortable with this clause, then discuss it on the front end. I think it's a reasonable clause if it's not too broad. Termination and separation. This is going to be really important to look at in your agreement. So what other additional terms will they want to hold you to, or you will want to hold them to when you're going to leave? You know, listen, I want to have if I'm going to separate, I want to make sure that I have the ability to have health care insurance. I want to make sure I get paid for all outstanding work that I perform. Those are generally things that are in an agreement that sound standard, but it needs to be there. So whatever additional terms are important to you. And then the most important conversation in this discussion about termination and separation is with and without cause. With is fairly simple, but many people don't go down that pathway. With cause means there's been a performance issue that they can demonstrate, and it's been an ongoing performance issue, or there's a conduct problem. You know, there may have been a criminal offense or charges or something along those lines, or something that has embarrassed the organization. There's oftentimes a component listed in this clause that if you materially damage the reputation of the organization you're working for, you can be terminated for cause. Incapacity. I hate to say it, but if you die, they're going to terminate you with cause. Not in a negative way. You won't know. But nonetheless, that falls under this category. And so you have to understand what exactly that means. And the reason why it's not pursued as often is because oftentimes an employer will look at it and say, you know what? We have the burden of proof. If there's a performance issue, we need to show that we've given you an ample time to improve it. We need to prove that this has been a performance issue worthy of your termination and removing some of your rights and ending the relationship now. So a lot of times people say, yeah, we're unhappy, but we will just terminate without cause. Now, this is where a lot of clinicians get upset too when they talk about due process. Remember, due process is afforded to you in every medical staff set of bylaws that I've ever seen. And so you are afforded due process through your medical staff rights and bylaws. And that may be the case as well with nursing and the employment relationship with the hospital. So you'll have to look into that. Where this gets complicated for people, I believe, is they say, well, you know what, it's not appropriate for somebody to tell me that I can't work here anymore in 90 days. And I won't ask you because it can be a contentious topic, but there are many clinicians out there that say, that is wrong. You cannot terminate me without cause and tell me that I have to look for another job in 91 days because I have a termination clause of 90 days. My response, and this is from a legal standpoint, this isn't a judgment, but think of it in this way. Flip it 180 degrees the other direction. So let's say that the people who were over here I think they raised their hand that were from California. Let's say you wanted to move to Nashville. You just wanted to go. And you said, listen, I want to move to Nashville because I was at the ED Benchmarking Alliance Innovations Conference and it was wonderful and I just want to live there. So I'm giving you my 90 days notice and I want to leave. And they'd have to say, okay, well, we'll have you work out your notice unless we agree to make it shorter if you want to, but we owe you the 90 days and you can go. So what's wrong with the hospital doing the same? Remember the concept of bilaterality. Would it be unfair for the hospital to say, you know what? I'm sorry. You can't go. We like you in California, and we're not letting you go to Nashville. No. Well, if you have the right to give 90 days notice, why doesn't the employer have the right, for a variety of reasons, without cause, to give you 90 days notice? Now, again, if the psychological contract is intact and you're paying attention to the environment. So, for instance, if volumes have significantly decreased, 2 emergency departments, 2 freestanding EDs, and 1 urgent care center opened up across the street, and you can't support the size staff that you have now, you're going to have to reduce the staff. That's going to have to happen. So be aware of these things. But just think in terms of bilaterality when you see termination without cause. And if you want that right, they also must have that right. But hopefully you won't be caught surprised by that if it happens. And again, your notice period must be respected unless that's renegotiated. If they say, listen, yeah, you can just go now, well, they should pay out the notice period, the number of hours that you would normally work during that time period, because you're owed the notice period. All right, so additional information here is really, I think, is helpful to talk a little bit, but briefly, about non-competes and restrictive covenants. Because as you decide to leave an organization, what can you do and where can you go? A lot of these, quite honestly, are not enforceable. They're not enforceable, and this is at the state level. The purpose of this, from my perspective, and this is a bit of an oversimplification, but it's to send a message First of all, to the employee or the independent contractor, hey, we worked hard to develop this business relationship. We mortgaged our homes. We created this group. We don't need you going to the CEO around us and stealing our business. We have a lot at risk here. That's not cool. So we're letting you know that you're not allowed to do that. And it also sends a message to the facility saying, hey, you can't let us build up a wonderful service for you over 3, 4, or 5 years, and now that you have everything running perfectly, then say, oh, well, we're just going to give it to somebody else, or we're going to internalize this, and we're going to use all the great work that you perform. So some groups will have them in an agreement just to be able to send a message to the facility that you can't just take all of our people. You can internalize this or go somewhere else, but our people may want to stay with us. So just to give you a sense of why sometimes these are utilized, and this is not unique to healthcare. This is utilized in many, many industries. And again, enforceability is variable from state to state. And really, if you have a narrowly defined business interest, narrowly defined, like at the doorstep of the business that you have, that's probably reasonable and in many cases is enforceable. If you believe your business interest is an entire state, or you have so many contracts that someone would have to leave the state because of your restrictive covenant, that's not going to be enforceable. That's not fair. And so you just have to keep in mind what these mean to you. And if you're uncomfortable with this concept, you could negotiate this and say, I don't want it in the agreement. If you believe philosophically you don't agree with it, but there's nowhere else you would want to be in the area, is this the bargaining chip you want to use in your negotiation? I would suggest it probably is not, based on philosophical grounds, because you can't get everything you want in a negotiation. If you want a non-compete removed on philosophical grounds, you're not allowing yourself to negotiate something else. So be careful and be cautious with that. And then non-solicitation. So once you leave, and then everyone in the room, to a certain degree, is in a leadership capacity, they don't want you to recruit away the other employees, and they don't want you to recruit vendor relationships. So when you leave, they want you to make sure for a certain period of time, a year or 2 years or whatever it is, that you are not engaged in any of those activities, and you will generally have to be held to that. All right, a cure period is important. So if you or the institution or the employer breaches the agreement, they promised something and they didn't do it, they've damaged the psychological contract and they violated the agreement, generally there's roughly about a 30-day cure period. Oh, you've now notified us that we were supposed to give you X number of shifts and we haven't done that. You've considered that a material breach of the agreement. We have 30 days to fix all of that for you. And then if we don't, you may have grounds to terminate your agreement with cause or for cause because we did not cure it. But there's usually a cure period involved. The separation agreement is important, that if there's certain things that they want or certain things that you want, you need to talk about that. And sometimes there's an additional agreement that you sign to say, well, if you're going to go, here are the things we want you to do, and here are the things that we will do for you, or it's just an emphasis of the things that were in the employment agreement. So make sure as you leave, you might want to ask for a separation agreement so you understand the expectations, if it's not clear, in the agreement at that point in time. Contract reviews. How many of you have turned over your agreement for someone else to review? And I think this can be done by colleagues, friends, attendings. Particularly residents oftentimes do this. They'll have their attendings review an agreement. That's fine because they've seen agreements, but do they have legal expertise, education, and training? I don't know that they do. So I would just ask a few questions, and I've asked residents these questions. So when you have a plumbing problem, a leaky faucet, you've plugged up a toilet, do you call your attending or your friend to come over and do it? No, you would not be friends very long if you did that. So marriage counseling, you're struggling with relationship matters. Do you bring your attending or one of your colleagues over to sit down and mitigate the issue? No. Personal training, I don't know. I don't think that we would use necessarily a lot of our attendings or a lot of our friends or colleagues to be our personal trainers, interior design, none of these things. So why would we abdicate to them something so important as legal advice? You wouldn't. Now, you can have them look at it, but I think it's very easy, quite honestly, to spend somewhere between $500 to $1,000 and just have somebody review the agreement if you want to. Make sure the scope of engagement is very clear, and it can be a flat fee. There are others that can do it cheaper, but this may be well-spent money on the front end so that you have an agreement that makes sense, and I would absolutely make sure, I'm going to emphasize, you define the scope of engagement. I had one experience several years ago where a physician I had hired, he had empowered the attorney to negotiate on his behalf. We had already agreed to the terms of the employment. I got a phone call from the CEO of the hospital that said, "You're new here, you're hiring your staff. I just spent 30 minutes on the phone with an attorney on behalf of Dr. So-and-so, and they wanted X, Y, and Z, including a 30-year mortgage, 0% interest from the hospital to cover his home." I said, "I'll take care of it." I said, "What did you do?" "Oh, well, I told them they could look into things for me." If you don't define the scope of engagement, you can damage your relationship. It was hard for him to recreate that relationship. He had barely started with the CEO of the hospital. But we worked through it and we repaired that. So make sure that it's a well-defined scope, and I think it should be a flat fee. All right, so avoiding the unexpected. And we'll close on these comments. Understand your obligations and perform to them. What do they expect of you? If you start showing up late for work, if you start creating a lot of medical error, if you're not completing your charts, these should be indications for you that maybe your performance is falling below the standards of expectation. So monitor your own performance. Situational awareness and emotional intelligence are sometimes lost on some people, but they are critically important. If people seem to be happy with your performance, they probably are. If people seem to be unhappy or disinterested in you and your performance, something is not right, and you need to look into that before it becomes a big problem. I would request periodic performance reviews. This creates awareness on both sides. So how am I doing? Well, you're doing great, but you could fix these two things. Fine, I'll fix them. Let me know when they're fixed. If someone comes to you later and says, "Hey, we're having a problem," we had a performance review. You said my performance was fine. This is not okay. I was not notified. And I think you really can clarify expectations with that process. And I want you to help me finish this statement. Measure twice, cut once. So in our roles, we can create issues for ourselves and for others. Be wise. Think about the actions that we take. Think about how we communicate with people. Think about how we conduct ourselves and make sure we respect others. I know that we work together as a family in our departments, and that can make us relax quite a bit. But as leaders, if you relax too much and you remove the standards of leadership performance, you can get yourself into trouble significantly. So make sure that you really think twice before you tell jokes in the department or you deviate from what you think would be the leadership expectations of your role. Well, thank you so much, and Mike was right. All of you are great, and I was so thankful to spend the morning with you. Have a great day, everyone.